Welcome to the Dylan Experience. Today is episode 43, and I've got a great guest for you. Now, I had the pleasure of joining my next guest on one of his podcasts, Wellness Unfiltered, where we had an awesome panel discussion on mental health with two other people. I'm sure that we'll talk a little bit about that. It was a great podcast. At this point, when this comes out, it'll probably be earlier this year, and I'll link that in the bottom. In the description. But today he joins me for a one-on-one conversation about his story, his life, and what he's learned throughout it. For starters, he survived an attempted murder, losing his life savings in a failed business venture, and has lost over 100 pounds and kept it off, just to name a few things. He used to suffer from multiple anxiety episodes a day and now has dramatically minimized their effect on his life. My guest today is a podcast host of 3 podcasts, which would give me enough anxiety for, a lifetime, a nutrition coach, a husband, and a father. I'm excited to share with you Jonathan McLernon. Jonathan, how are you? You're muted.
Sorry, I like to be muted during the introduction just in case I clear my throat or something.
You're good. I'll edit just that little part out. So go ahead. Jonathan,
Yeah,
how are you?
it's a pleasure to be here, man. And I love your story as well. And I'm excited to get a chance to dive into yours on one of my other podcasts. So yeah, it's the start of something good, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, it's funny kind of having you here. We talked. What's funny is like my guests are going to see this probably 3 or 4 months apart, but we talked just last week. So it's just like,
Yeah.
I feel like we just had this conversation and kind of digging into you after we had a deep, it's interesting because we kind of did this backwards. We
Right.
talked
Yeah.
about all of the stuff that we wanted to talk about, but we had no background of who each other are. And so, now we're going to dig into who's Jonathan. Next time we're going to deal with who's Dylan, and we're going to dig into these stories. And then I feel like we should have another conversation to just like, now that I know this, we can have a conversation.
That's when you come on my third podcast.
So let's start there. What are your podcasts? Tell my audience a little bit about what you do with those podcasts specifically.
Yeah, so my flagship one would be called Between the Before and After. And that's one where I just want to start telling people's stories, because social media shows us before and after photos, but they don't really explore the human story. And it sort of leaves us with this perception that, somehow they just went on this path and did everything right and just got to this place and it was amazing and inspiring. And it's amazing and inspiring, but the path was a lot bumpier. And so I joke that like the way we imagine the transformation going is like I show up my unicorn steed, you hop on your unicorn, we ride the rainbow bridge to the clouds, and we just coast above reality until you reach your goal, and then somehow drop you back into real life and expect that you're going to make it.
Right.
When in reality, it's more like you're standing in front of a tunnel of sewage, and I show up with a pair of kayaks instead of hip waders.
Yeah.
And I go, we're going to go through this pretty shitty journey. It's actually going to be okay though, because you're going to discover how strong you are. But if you go into it with the right expectation, you're much more likely to stay there. So I wanted to tell people stories of what it really looks like to go through amazing experiences. So, I've got like leukemia survivors, breast cancer, like a lot of cancer guests have come on in recent times, because I think that's a particularly notable one. But it's a travel writer who gave up a 25-year corporate career to become a traveling nomad, in her 50s when people thought she was nuts. So just really interesting human stories. The second one is called Wellness Unfiltered. And we really want to start having a discussion around the gap between sort of our medical system and the kind of care people need to receive, and get people educated on what resources are available to them as kind of an adjunct to our medical system, because it's there as a triage. It's there to take care of you in a worst case scenario. That's ultimately what it is. And that's why if you go there and you're not in worst case scenario, you're probably going to be, handed a prescription and sent home. Right. It's a flaw in the system. It's not a flaw in the individuals that are a part of the system, but it's just how it's set up and kind of where health has been trending. And so we wanted to open up discussions with experts in various fields and professions and get people educated and aware that there's these really cool modalities that can be very helpful for you. We want you to become a participant rather than a patient in your own health.
Yeah. And that's the podcast that I was on, just for clarification.
Yeah, we had just a brilliant discussion in and around mental health, and you're an extremely valuable addition. And the third one is called It's Not So Black and White. And that one we're straying away from maybe not exactly the field of wellness, but having conversations around society, culture, politics, that kind of thing, but nuanced discussions, because I really feel like we're losing connection to the ability to think critically. Every one of us is emotional. We feel emotions around incidents and things that get publicized, but do we still have the ability to step back and say, despite my emotions, I want to try and think clearly about this? Can we disagree in a civil manner and actually still coexist? So I really wanted to open up discussions like that. And so that one's kind of just in its infancy, but it's one that I'm really kind of excited about. It's more of a passion project. The others are really connected to what I do professionally as a nutritionist.
Hmm.
But this is just a personal passion project of mine where I want to host meaningful conversations around difficult topics where we can show it's possible to have like nuance and civil discourse.
Yeah. And that's, man, that's needed, like really needed in terms of, and I think maybe that's a product of what's happened over the last 20 years.
Yeah.
Certainly, you're in Canada, I'm in America. 2016 election was a nightmare, right? Like even the 2020 election was a nightmare. But
Yeah.
I think the 2016 election kind of highlighted this massive paradox of something that I don't know really exists, although it's been manufactured in a way of polarity, right? Of this
Yeah. Yeah.
hyper polarity that really doesn't, when you have conversations with people, it doesn't really exist. It's
Yeah.
this almost manufactured script of you need to say what this person said to put this person on their toes, and win the conversation. But in reality,
Right.
you're losing the relationship if you're winning the argument.
I love that. You're losing the relationship if you're winning the argument. Like that's, and Donald Trump, he's a master of this. Like he just figured out how to play the game.
Mm-hmm.
Like I believe he's a narcissist at least. I don't hold necessarily any ill will because I don't know the guy personally, so I can't really say like I hate the guy, for example. But I just try to observe his behavior and make pass judgment on his behavior versus him as a human being, and go like he mastered the art of polarization.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we, and it makes sense when you look at how you're very familiar with how our brain works, right? Something that's going to drive us into a more defensive emotional state is going to get a much stronger reaction than something that's going to require logical calculation. And so if you want to get people on board, and people have been doing this leaders have been doing this for eons, basically, get the people rallied up around and emotive around some kind of cause. You think about these motivational speeches or rallying the troops or things like that,
Mm-hmm.
get some emotion invested in it, and you can get them to take action, even if it's on an untruthful premise. And it's kind of I don't want to call it a flaw because I think our brains are engineered pretty amazingly, but it's kind of how the brain works. And if we're not aware of that, we're much more susceptible to being steered and manipulated.
Yeah. It's only a flaw if it's used inappropriately, right? Like, so anything
Yeah.
that you have can be a flaw. And what's interesting is you bring up Donald Trump, is, I'm not surprised, but that's only one side of the picture, right?
Right.
Like there's, there, I don't even know if it's really Donald Trump. Like here's how I kind
Right.
of look
Yeah.
at this. And this is interesting that we get in this conversation, but I don't look at it as much as a singular person kind of built this enigma.
Right. Product of the system that's been constructed.
It's media, right?
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
what is fed to us is what has really built this. I don't think if the media had such a dominance of control of information that Donald Trump would have came out of it as he did, or even
Right.
Hillary Clinton, or
Right.
Joe Biden, or Obama before him, Bush before
Yeah.
him.
Yeah.
It's like these singular people we like to give all of this claim to, of like these are the people that messed it up, but there's a whole system below them
Mm.
propping them up with millions and millions and billions of dollars in
Yes. Yeah.
media cost, trying to emphasize how important this issue is versus this issue.
Right. Really
And
shaping a narrative and using
yeah.
sort of their position of perceived authority
Hmm.
to convince us, essentially.
Yeah.
And you know, it's funny because I look at obviously I named Donald Trump because he's a polarizing figure, but I think he was a boon for the media. Like he was the greatest thing ever. Because you create this polarity, and for all
Yeah.
we know, I don't want. We can be conspiratorial if you want, but it's like, what about if they were all just playing a game? Because he didn't become a billionaire by accident. Like he's not stupid. He's an actor,
Hmm.
and he might be brash, and he might be maybe a blowhard, but he's not stupid.
Yeah.
And so he's an entertainer who knows how to work the media. What if they were playing a game for all we know? You know, it's like I just figure he'd go on Twitter and get people barking up one tree and then go and do something else.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and like you have to. I don't know. I don't want to call it admiration because you know our prime minister said something pretty controversial when he described his admiration for the basic dictatorship of China. That's our current leader, and I was like, woof. I'm not sure I like that statement.
Right.
But there's an element of like you're better than we give you credit for, because and maybe George Bush was the same way. He played the country bumpkin when it's like he's really not that stupid.
No.
But it's like this is the persona that you want to see. This is the persona. I mean, it's like it's acting.
Yeah.
And what
That's,
happens behind closed doors probably looks a lot different.
you know, and that's one of the things, like I'm learning what it's like in that realm in some capacity. Cause I have almost 600,000 followers on TikTok, and it's like, people don't really know who I am completely, and they never will. Right. Because
Yeah.
I don't need to reveal everything to everyone. Right. And
Yeah.
so, you know, I heard I heard Jordan Peterson kind of talking about this, and, you know, I keep bringing him up because I keep seeing him. And
Yeah.
it's interesting because, like, he's in this position too, but he was talking to Matthew McConaughey on his podcast about his book, Green Lights, and more specifically about what it's like being a celebrity or anyone of fame or anyone with great attention. And this idea of you begin to act the part, and sometimes the part becomes you. And
Right. Yeah.
if you don't have the clarity to deliver to yourself what you want to be, and to stop kind of emphasizing that role that you have to play, this is, I think, one of the biggest difficulties in people's lives who become celebrities, who become people, you know, influencers, or anyone of great attention, that they forget that there's two different people. There's one behind closed doors and there's one in the open. And the media likes to expose the one behind closed doors and shame that person to change how they act in front of people. And that becomes such a remarkably powerful situation for the media to play, when in reality, I mean, you can see Will Smith right now. I mean, my God, right? Like, at the time we're filming or, you know, recording this, Will Smith just smacked Chris Rock on stage, you know, and this is, I could care less, right? Because it makes no effect on my life other than what I see on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, all the social media.
It's been a boom for meme makers.
Oh my God. Like, all I see is Chris Rock and Will Smith. It's like, what?
I mean, I've heard Chris Rock's tour like sold out all of a sudden.
Oh, of course it will.
Right. And I like to ask the question, like, who's making money off of this? Because, you know, I fomented a little bit of a debate on my social media, because I guess I played the game a little bit, and I made a post just suggesting that it was staged, you know, and I don't know, as if I know what's going on, right? I just wrote a post though. I was like, I'm just going to suggest that this was staged because tabloids have been playing this game forever. Create drama, people get sucked in, and people are saying, well, how do they benefit? I'm like, when is this level of publicity ever bad for someone in the public eye? Because maybe it's a little bit polarizing. So we talk about polarity. Though there'll be those who think Will Smith is a hero for standing up for his wife. Mm-hmm. Maybe those have more traditional conservative values. Then there will be those that like defend Chris Rock because they feel like, you know,
freedom of speech and comedy.
Freedom of speech.
Yeah.
And so they're both, you know, you could say there might be just a teensy-weensy little bit of blowback where some people think they're bad people for whatever they did. But you stretch this out over any length of time, this level of attention, and bring them back into the public consciousness in such a big way, they stand to benefit massively. Mm-hmm. And it's only being talked about because it's being put in front of our faces. Yeah. And I feel a little bit conflicted even talking about it, because right now there's conflicts happening around the world where human beings' lives are being torn apart.
Right.
And here we are talking about a guy slapped another guy in a trophy show that nobody cares about.
Yeah. Right.
But it's being made to feel relevant.
Yeah. And what's interesting to me is, like, you can look at it both ways of, like, maybe it's staged. Okay. How, you know, what does that look like in terms of identity for both Chris Rock and Will Smith? Right. And how does that impact their identities long term versus the other thing? What if it's not
Right.
staged? What if it's real, right?
Right.
How
Yeah.
does that impact our identities? What's remarkably interesting is they're very similar, right? There's
Yeah.
likely, in the long term, there's likely regret, there's likely
Mhm.
shame, right? Because
Yeah.
either way, they did something wrong, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like
Either
maybe
way.
not,
Yeah.
and I wouldn't say,
I mean, it could have
comedy's,
been a bit, like not exactly a bit, but maybe like my wife is an improv theater performer,
yeah,
and you sort of set some things up and then you see where it goes. And it could have been something like that as well, right? Where maybe this has unintended consequences or
yeah,
spillover effects. We didn't expect it to go this far. We didn't expect it to go this direction.
yeah,
You know, like because again, I go back to like sort of the institution itself has been sort of falling out of favor with the public, and so it's
right.
like they're needing. I don't know if it was a couple of years ago or whenever it was, like Ricky Gervais. I think that's
Oh
the
yeah,
last time I heard anything about the Oscars was him,
yep,
because he was blasting the sort of degenerate behavior coming out of Hollywood.
yeah,
And I don't think that was scripted. Like that felt pretty genuine, because like that was like giving them both barrels and just calling
right.
them out. But I don't know. Again, is it some? There's the concept of like controlled opposition. Like is that he's a millionaire too? Like, but yeah, I didn't mean to hijack away from sort of discussing Chris Rock and Will Smith's identities, but just sort of I like to zoom out a little bit and look at sort of the bigger picture and go, yeah.
Yeah,
But you're right. I think both of them, if they have a conscience, which I believe they do, will look back on this and go, this kind of, even though it benefited us financially, like it didn't really go the way that either of us sort of wanted to see it playing out.
yeah,
We didn't see it playing out the way it did, and that
yeah.
might be, maybe that's more reasonable.
And that's that kind of deferential feeling of who am I playing and who
Hmm.
am I?
Hmm.
Of like at some point you're going to look back and you're going to say, did I do this right?
Right.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
if you try to play a part, right? And maybe this is scripted, uh, guess what happens, right? You're going to look
Yeah.
back and you're
Yeah.
like, did I do it right?
Yeah.
Or if it's not scripted, how did I react? Did I do it right? The question gets asked the same way,
Yeah.
but in different circumstances. And the
Yeah.
reality is if you don't have, this is kind of where not just our political system, but our entire society kind of lives on what is right and wrong. And we don't, I think we talked about this a little bit in your podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Um, when you don't have a value system that creates a rule system for yourself, this is what I value, so this is how I'm going to respond, this is how I'm going to react. You do things like whatever direction Will Smith and Chris Rock went, you do things like that, in
Right.
which puts you in a position where you have to determine, like, both, like I think Will Smith apologized, right?
Yeah.
And either way, whether it's staged or not, like, it's not a comfortable place to be for either way, you
Yeah.
know and and that I think the uncomfortability comes at different times, right? If it's staged, well,
Yeah.
it won't be uncomfortable right now because you expected it, but it will
Right.
come someday.
Yeah. That's an
unless
interesting thought. Yeah.
unless you're a narcissist, right? And you have no emotional attachment to being wrong in any capacity. But
Right.
that is
Because
in itself unhealthy.
I mean, I thought about like what comes next, like the apology tour, the talk show circuit. They're
Yeah.
probably both going to do that. So so again, maybe this wasn't staged, but there's people waiting in the wings to scoop this up and maybe even use them.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe this was just very real beef between two gents,
Yeah.
and the media is going to scoop this up. We're going to throw you in the whole talk show circuit. You're going to get booked out for the next year straight talking about this whole incident, and make money off these paid appearances. Write another book. Do the apology tour. Chris Rock's going to continue to do irreverent comedy, and those who love him will love him more.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but I think about this because, like, obviously my wife is an actor, and when she goes on stage and like plays a part, like there's a part of me that I'm like, gosh, she's good. Like, because I sometimes forget that she's my wife. Other times I look at her and I go, like, I actually hurt when she's acting. Maybe she's a very emotive actor. She does a great job of like making people cry, like not by being mean, but just by being human, raw, authentic, and genuine. And
Right.
like my heart actually hurts, even though I know she's acting and playing a part. She's that good. And so I think about this and I wonder, those who do rise to this level of extreme attention, they become almost like de-anchored. Well, I was thinking about maybe this is a really good use of the word demoralized.
Yeah.
So immoral is maybe another way to express like a value. And
Yeah.
when you become disconnected, or you're no longer anchored to the morals that you held to be true, the values you held to be true, you become a lot more malleable.
Hmm.
You just sort of go with the shifting winds of opinion. But that's got to like breed a lot of anxiety and depression,
Yeah.
I would think. How you feeling not connected to something. And I think there's a, I don't, is it Harrelson? Not Woody Harrelson. Anyways, there's an actor who like lives in Wyoming somewhere, just has like a ranch, and he's an old guy in his 70s. I don't know famous people very well, clearly,
That's all right.
but he shows up and he does his movie, and then he just goes back to his ranch and says like, "See you later, everybody. I'm
Yeah.
just gonna go ranch." And I think that's the best way to do it. Go collect your millions upon millions, and then go back to your ranch and just be human and connected to the land.
Yeah.
Like, how amazing is that?
That's, and I'm not big, right?
Right? Yeah.
I got a couple 100,000. That's about all I got. Um, but it's enough for me to recognize that, like, I love that idea of that demoralization where you're losing your morals in the attempt to send the message, create the influence, reach the crowd, influence opinion, whatever you're trying to do, make money even.
Yeah.
You lose sight of who you are because who you are didn't get you where you are, right? Like in many regards, who I was 3 years ago did not get me where I am right now. Right.
Right.
I had to change. I had to adjust. And I think as I've stepped into this journey, I've had to limit how far I go. Right. I've had to limit how far I adjust because I could make TikTok content every single day if I wanted to. I could
Right.
make YouTube videos. I could make podcasts every single day. And I've done it, right? I've done all of it. But I can tell you what, I fucking hated it, right?
Yeah.
I did not enjoy it. I did not like trying to go live all the time and pander to people and talk to them about their emotional well-being every single day of my life because it was exhausting, right?
Yeah. Because you're just
And
one human being, and you have a
and
finite amount of resources available to you.
absolutely. And I could build, I know that my business could be more right now.
Mm-hmm.
I know that my podcast could probably be more. I know my TikTok could be more, but I'm not willing to disengage from what I know I need to go reach that goal because that goal isn't as important to me as the people that live in the house behind me, right?
Yeah.
As the not only that, I shouldn't even step outside of myself. It's not as important as my own happiness, my own peace, my own comfort in being happy with the life I have around me. I already spend enough time away from my family because I'm stuck in this room doing all the things that I do. I don't want to spend any more, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I try to be a time management ninja or wizard or something like
Yeah.
that, because people wonder, well, how do you do like 3 podcasts? I'm like, well, I just created a really efficient system. And I basically try to
Yep.
create a no edit podcast and just make that a part of it. Hey,
That's yep.
I'm not editing out the ums, the ahs, all that kind of stuff. You're just going to hear a raw conversation. But there's certain things that I put in my schedule, and I used to feel guilty about it. I don't anymore. So morning snuggle time with my family, that goes in my schedule. Because sometimes I sleep downstairs in the spare bedroom, not because we're having a disagreement, because my kid wakes up 8 times a night, and I sometimes need to get a good night's sleep.
Mm-hmm.
And my wife, thankfully, is stay at home at this point in time, and so we have a mutual agreement for that. But that means in the morning I'm going up there and I'm snuggling with my wife, and then when my kid wakes up, he's jumping in with us, and we're gonna cuddle him and show him a bunch of love, and that like grounds me, that anchors me to this is what is most important to me. And if I start every day from that perspective, who am I really doing this for? I'm doing it for these 2 people who I love more than anybody else in the world. Remember that when I go to spend time on something. And is it benefiting them? That changes how I behave in this way. Because I agree. I tried the pumping out social media content like there was no tomorrow. I mean, I have a whopping, I think, 31 followers on TikTok. Like I am rocking the TikTok game right now.
And for context, if you didn't watch the podcast with me and Jonathan and Chris and who was Caitlin?
Caitlin, yeah, you
Yeah.
got it, man. Good memory.
So I told Jonathan he should try TikTok if he's looking to develop social media or
That's right.
develop that. And so I am I am probably the sole reason that you started TikTok.
You are actually. You get the credit for that. It was our discussion around finding authenticity on social media.
Yeah.
So because I have a tenuous relationship with social media at best, right? And so it's I feel like, okay, I'm trading a part of me. Like algorithms are studying my behavior patterns to create, predictions of how they think I'm going to behave in the future. That the long-term ramifications that do make me uncomfortable,
Yeah.
or data mining and I, truthfully, I still feel like TikTok is Chinese spyware, but then again, Facebook is American spyware. So what's the
Yeah.
difference?
Right.
you know, but it was this discussion around trying to find authenticity on a social media platform. I agree with you. Facebook is fighting families. Instagram is fake. Twitter is a dumpster fire. So maybe that's why people are going to TikTok. And I thought, well, I do have things of value to share and I would like to reach people. And I just decided that if I'm going to create a TikTok account, like right now, I'm filming us having this conversation. And I write down timestamps and I'll just grab a little clip with your permission and
Hmm.
put a clip on TikTok of 30 seconds of something being shared,
Yeah.
not edited. You're going to see the side of my head. You're going to see my nose, and that's going to go on TikTok. And if people like that, awesome. I'm not going to pretend to be something else to try to grow my following.
Yeah.
I'm just going to do that. And if people find it valuable and they like it, cool, it's going to grow. If I'm not adding value, it's not going to grow. But I'm not going to try and post 4 times a day. No way in hell.
Yeah. That's how I think. That's how I think you really develop a following that is worthwhile. You know.
Yeah. Yeah.
There are people. There's so many different contexts to this. Like, if you're a videographer and you just love making videos, you do the same thing, right?
Right.
If you are an actor and you're posting acting content, you do the same thing, right? You post what what you enjoy posting. And certainly there's times where you post things that you don't necessarily enjoy, but your audience would enjoy it.
Right. Yeah.
And so there's a piece of it where you're not necessarily pandering to their wants
Mm-mm.
and their wills and their needs, but you are noting that you're giving this to them because they want it. They
Right.
follow
Yeah.
you for a reason. And sometimes you're going to have to work for people, right? It's no
Right.
different
Yeah.
than a family. It's no different than a job. It's just a little bit different because it's a part of you, right? And
Oh,
so, for me, it's I I give value as much as I can because
yeah.
I know it's something that I would have loved to hear,
Yeah.
15 years ago. And that's how I kind of approach it.
Well, that's I think a lot of the stories of those of us who get into the coaching and mentorship type realm is I'm giving advice I wish I would have had 10 years ago. So I wouldn't have gone through 8 years of struggle.
Mhm.
But on the same token, I wouldn't remove those 8 years of struggle because it is what shaped me. And so there's a balancing act here where it's like, hey, if I can help you avoid some of the unnecessary struggles, cool. But I don't want to paint a picture that there isn't going to be a struggle. And I think that's where I try to create a difference.
Yep. That's my book is called Defy the Darkness for a reason, right? Like
Yeah.
you're not going to it's not eliminate the darkness, right? It's
Yeah.
defy it, right? Because you
Yeah.
have to step into this idea, or you have to step away from this idea that life is beautiful, it's perfect, it's exemplary. It's a dark and dismal place. And if you don't learn how to approach that dark and dismal place by bringing light, shining light, creating some form of beauty, crafting your own ability to recognize the good within the bad, because it's you can find all sorts of bad if you want to,
Yeah.
right? But if you don't learn how to craft goodness, develop it, foster it, um, you're going to live in that place. And I've watched people live in that place for decades. You know,
Yeah. I think it was Jordan Peterson who said, and I really enjoy him. I don't always agree with everything he says, but I really enjoy him. And here's where that nuance comes in. I enjoy people who make me think and challenge the perspectives I hold.
mm-hmm.
Because I don't feel like my sense of identity is being threatened because I'm open to the idea of having a perspective changed and growing and developing as a human being.
Yeah,
I don't claim to have it all figured out. But he said something along the lines that like life is misery. So you basically live, you get old, you lose your ability, and then you die.
yeah,
And it's like that's what life is. And so how do you fight that? you know. And I think it's exactly what you're describing here. I love that analogy of just you create light in the darkness. You become a shining light in the darkness. It doesn't make the darkness go away. It just pushes it back a little bit. And we look for those bright spots in life. And when they're there, you hold them. You know, we just filmed my son the other day taking his first steps. He'd taken a couple of totters here and there, like one step at a time. But he was legitimately, he walked like 8 steps, and we got it on film. And that just filled our heart with joy. We're like, we just love watching this development. It's like, and then he gives us this grin, and he only has like his bottom 2 teeth are sticking out, but his grin sort of covers his top teeth, so you just see his bottom 2 teeth sticking, and his eyes really scrunch up when he's genuinely smiling.
Yeah.
He gets, my wife has some Japanese in her heritage, and so he's kind of got that as well. These almond shaped sort of scrunchy eyes, and it's the most beautiful thing. Even though it's the goofiest looking grin, it's the most beautiful thing because it's so pure.
Yeah.
It's this pure delight, and it's moments like that that you go, like, this is why I'm doing this, like
Right.
to watch this happen. And
Yep.
you know, it's not because I want, you know, a million cheering fans. It's because I want this little fella to have a better future.
Yeah. And you can, you know, you can share that with people. And
Yeah.
that might be, you know, that's the interesting thing about social media can be the bright spot for people. You know, and
Yeah.
it's why people watch some of the videos they watch. They watch the comedy
Right.
videos. They watch, you know,
Yeah.
it's why they might watch Chris Rock or they might watch Will Smith. It's which is
Right.
funny.
Yeah.
You know, like there's nobody in this on this planet that's going to walk their way through it with nothing but good happening to them.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and so we have to find the pieces that keep us moving forward and developing our own perspective on what is good, what is bad. um, but if you live in this place of everything's bad, everything's wrong with the world, everything's painful, you know, one of the things and we're going to be talking about Jordan Peterson, I think, in this podcast a lot.
Yeah.
But one of the things he talks about in his most recent book is don't denigrate social institutions, you know, because they exist for a reason.
Right.
There's a purpose behind them and there's benefit to them. And I think it's a remarkably humbling thing to do, because when you look at these social institutions that have existed for a long time, if you just say, okay, let's defund the police,
Right.
well, there's a lot of consequences that are going to happen because of that, right?
Yeah.
There's no society on the planet right now that could benefit from that 100%, because
Right.
what's going to happen ultimately, maybe not in the next year or 2 years, depending on society, but in 10, 15, 20 years, there's going to be someone that steps up and says, I can be in control here. I can do
Yes.
something wrong here. I can
Yeah.
do something that used to be against the rules, but there's no one to hold me accountable.
To the values that we used to hold as a society. And I agree. For every million, say, police interactions that occur probably on a daily basis, I would say 99.9% of them are probably positive or reasonably positive outcomes. But
Or
it goes
not
back to,
negative.
or yeah, not negative. And so, but they're not the ones that reach the public consciousness. It's again the problem of the media machine,
Yeah.
where we have an attention based digital economy where eyeballs and clicks equal dollars, and it's clearly the most emotive content that's going to garner the most attention because it pushes us back into our primal brain where we feel the most threatened. And that's what these purveyors are doing deliberately, is pushing us into this primal I feel threatened state, because good news doesn't really sell. It won't sell unless we demand it, but the only way we get to the place where we demand it is if we have this conscious, like we consciously make an effort to look for the good, because we're kind of hardwired to look for the negative. It's a biological, you know, preservation mechanism, if we could call it that, to
Mhm.
look for the threats. Those are the things that, you know, as opposed looking for the good doesn't threaten our existence. It adds joy to our existence, but it's no threat to our survival. So it makes sense that we're kind of wired that way to hunt for threats. But then we have to create a society, we could even argue, where people have the freedom to not always be looking for threats.
Mhm.
And it's like we almost got there. Maybe we were there for a little bit. Maybe we actually had that for a bit, especially like Canada or the US. And maybe we're sort of sliding backwards a little bit right now. And it might be this backward slide where it causes us to appreciate what we had.
I'm you know what that makes me think of, and I don't know if I can agree with you necessarily on we had it, because I don't know, I don't know if we can look at, especially I look at the past 20 years, right? Because
Yeah.
the social media has been absolutely insane in the last 20 years of how interconnected we are, but yet disconnected we are.
Right. Yeah.
But there's still a piece to this, that interactions that were deemed not necessarily acceptable, but weren't necessarily addressed.
Mm-hmm.
I would say things like domestic violence.
Yeah. True.
A man treating a woman physically or emotionally abusive in public 25-30 years ago was not necessarily addressed, and even now is probably not necessarily addressed to the level it should be. Or a woman being I don't even know, like just acting
Well,
in a poor manner
well,
towards a man, right?
sure. My brother unfortunately is married to a very emotionally abusive woman,
Right.
and
And so
she wields his children basically.
right, that, I mean, that kind of restriction on male parenthood, like these things were never really addressed until social media kind of exposed them to the forefront of like,
Right.
oh
Like gave
hey,
people a voice.
this is a problem. And so, I think what we're stepping into right now is a moment in time where social media is the exposure that I think media used to be, right? Where media used to say, hey, this is a good idea, right? And then all of a sudden, I think capitalism kind of took over in the media. Corruption probably took over in the media. These are, I'm sure they're provable, but it's
Right.
anecdotal at this point, because
Of
I don't
course.
have the
You
response
don't.
or the
Oh, you come on.
knowledge. But
Yeah.
we all kind of know, right?
Yeah. We
We
have an
all
intuitive sense that something feels off here.
right. And I think even social media has some form of corruption. That's why Facebook and Instagram are the way that they are, and certainly YouTube is the way. Like I look at this in terms of like, there's an industry here, and I have experience in this industry that is fundamentally suppressed, and that's firearms, right? Like
Right.
I'm a firearms instructor, right? Like,
Yeah.
but I don't dare post very much firearms content on my channel, because guess what? No matter what platform you join or you go on, you can't talk about it, right? You can't
Right.
talk about firearms. And that, like, but there's a fundamental rule in the United States Constitution, right? The Second Amendment, that says these are allowed. But because of how deep this problem is kind of entrenched in the media, not necessarily conspiratorial mindset, but like this media development of how we look at it, we can't have a
Yeah.
conversation.
Right. We're losing the ability for nuance.
Right.
Like, you just said earlier on, like, I kind of disagree with you. And I think that's brilliant. I'm like, sweet. I wanted to hear what you had to say there. I was like, cool. Because I like my perspective being challenged. What occurred to me was, though, is kind of thinking about the progress we have made. Because you mentioned like the media, or maybe social media, has become like where we expose this behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost like there's these pendulum swings that take place. And the pendulum was sitting way over on one side, because I think sometimes the social media exposure game has gone a little bit too far, maybe way too
Certainly.
far in some instances. But it's kind of this pendulum swing, this reactionary rhetoric that develops around, now we hold a degree of power because we have an amplifier that we never had before through social media and smartphones.
Yeah.
And so, but overall, I think it is a net positive that we have this, but we're now going through this kind of this age of reckoning where we're figuring out, how do we use, like, social media is like a baby in
Yeah.
terms of human development and civilization. So
Right.
how do we use this tool in a justifiable fashion, like for predominantly good? I don't think anything's ever going to be like perfectly used for good. I don't, call me slightly cynical, but I don't believe we can ever erase the bad in the world.
No.
But we can definitely move towards creating more good in the world, and that's something that we should aspire to.
Yeah.
And
And
so
that's, that what kind of makes me think about that is like why I think firearms are so suppressed in media, or not necessarily media, but social media, is the idea of like the harm they can do, right?
mm-hmm,
But
mm-hmm.
it's not necessarily a harm the gun can do, it's the harm the person can do with the gun. It's the exponentially more effective means than, say, a knife or
It's a
your
force
hands.
multiplier.
And so, but essentially social media itself is a force multiplier.
Right.
Right.
Yep.
Social media could be the most dangerous weapon on the planet. And I think I think what we're seeing in Ukraine right now is a remarkable use of social media by Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
There's a, not to say it's wrong or anything, but Ukraine is using social media to effectively gain support around the world. Russia is not, right? Russia's suppressing its own social media, so nobody really understands the whole conflict within Russia. And so I think all of this comes down to the rules around freedom of speech and how do they apply to social media? How can they be crafted and in a fair way of like do we allow guns? Do we allow discussion of certain topics? Is social media just basically becoming the book burning of Nuremberg? How do we look at freedom of speech?
Right. Why can't, like, I'm not opposed to some degree of curation of content, but we straddle this fine line because my fear is, like, I think it comes from Game of Thrones. If you cut out a man's tongue, you don't prove him wrong. You prove you're afraid of what he has to say.
Yeah.
And my thought on this is, and it's why I started the podcast, it's not so black and white. And this sounds a little bit crazy, but a part of me kind of wants to have a white supremacist, hopefully an articulate one. Maybe they're not all dumb, but like have a white supremacist on, and if they're open to having their views like questioned to be understood, because it's like, if we want to understand how people get to a certain position, we don't correct them by saying we're going to cut out your tongue. That doesn't change. That makes them even more radical. Yeah. That pushes them into a corner. But it's like, if we're ever going to have any hope of maybe changing this idea, because, for example, I live in Eastern Europe. Ukraine's a hotbed of white supremacy that sort of, talk about things that don't get talked about. They have an entire battalion of like hardcore white supremacists who've been carrying out war crimes for 8 years that nobody cared about or talked about.
Yep. This
is not me, and I want to be careful in my words, because this isn't me condoning the actions of Russia or the actions of their government or their military.
Right.
I don't think what they're doing is right. But on the same token, there's more nuance to this discussion here, because you have a militia of more, it was at least prior to this conflict, more than 60,000 strong hardcore white supremacists who were carrying out war crimes in Eastern Ukraine, and nobody cared.
Right.
We only started caring when it became sort of relevant to maybe our sphere of the world. And we could, go down the rabbit hole of we have limited, finite capacity for empathy, but hey, 400,000 people killed in the Yemen conflict. Does that make it to the conversation? Like, so how do we decide what gets to the conversation?
Right.
Yeah.
And when you like that idea that there's 8 billion people on the planet, like we can't talk about all of them.
Right.
But at the same time, you can, right? That's what social media has kind of proved, is that you can have these conversations. But the problem is that the algorithm right now determines which ones go viral and who everyone sees versus who might locally see something or specifically see something. Someone might be paying attention to Ukraine and be paying attention to what you talked about in terms of that white supremacist brigade. Like it just goes along with your podcast. Like, it's just not so black and white. It's like there's so much nuance to it. There's so many fine details that we don't understand. And that's why I said, like, I don't necessarily disagree with what Ukraine's doing, but at the same time, there's hesitation because, Ukraine's been in this conflict for 8 years. And certainly Russia has conducted things that are atrocities. You can't tell me that. I was going to say, you can't tell me in 8 years of war that Ukrainians haven't done the same thing in response, right? And so, how do we, it always comes back of like, how do we approach this idea that humans are capable of disgusting things, atrocious, evil things, and what then do we do about it? right? Is the reaction justified? Is it not justified? Are the means justified, by the end? You know, America has a lot to answer for itself in terms of that,
Yeah.
because we've been doing this for a very long time in the world,
Kind of almost acting like the world's police force,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe justifiably, maybe not. And you know, it's not something that I would put on the shoulders of any individual American citizen. Be like, you're you know, kind of the way that it happened with average Russian people. I thought that that's like terrible what's happening, because I'm like, like they're just a human being. They didn't ask to be born Russian,
Right.
you know. So to put it on, you know, say like, because your government hasn't been involved in 80% of like the bombing campaigns that have happened since World War II, that you as an American citizen are like subhuman or something like that.
Yeah.
And again, I think that's where, so social media can be a powerful amplifier, but in the same token, it can also be a rallying cry for sort of mob violence or
Yep.
mob cancel culture, where again we stop we stop thinking about like the individual here, and we just go like, we're just going to wipe out this entire thing, and so we get trapped in kind of this binary thinking, you know,
Yeah.
of everything under this umbrella is bad, so
Right.
we should just annihilate it. Well, the problem still exists, and the problem resides within every one of us as human beings. And I think that's what all of us who aren't sociopaths grapple with, is we all have a little darkness in us.
Yep.
Whether or not we want to talk about it, it exists. I don't behave like a perfect human being. Like, I try to tell it to people, like, I'm not a virtuous monk. I'm just a guy who's fighting my own struggle and sharing my struggle
Mm-hmm.
to try to inspire you to also fight the good fight.
Yep. And to be able to communicate it is what my
Yeah.
goal is, right?
Yeah.
Because when I can be, you know, when I can open up and say, I've struggled with this, and you can look at me and say, so have I, right?
Yeah.
It's a
Yeah.
lot better than me saying I've struggled with this and you saying get the fuck over it.
Right.
Right.
Yes.
Like there's a vast difference in the response there. And so when we have the ability to, and this is my argument for freedom of speech, when you have the ability to expose something and not necessarily expect judgment immediately, right? If I say, I really like this, and you say, well, I used to like that, but then I realized it was doing this to me, right? And you help me understand that, right? When two human beings can open up a conversation about something that's not necessarily just controversial, but something that's bad for you, right?
Right.
Whether proven or unproven doesn't really matter, right? I've really been considering smoking, and Jonathan looks at me and says, I used to smoke till I got lung cancer, and
Yeah.
that's not saying you'll get lung cancer, but I can tell you what, if you do, I can tell you how much it sucks, right? Rather than saying, Dylan, don't be a fucking moron and go
Right. Yeah.
smoking,
Yeah.
right? And then I'm
Yeah.
like, well, now I can't talk to him about it.
Right.
And realistically, all I was looking for was for you to tell me your experience with smoking, right? That was just my
Right.
way of bringing it up,
Right. Yeah.
you know?
And that's a brilliant analogy, because I often use smoking as an example of a behavior that solves a problem.
Yeah.
And if we look at, I try to say that all behavior makes sense, but in order to be able to see it through that lens, you kind of have to understand a bit of the backstory and how the human brain works.
Yeah.
But once you put those two pieces together, you go, aha, I see why this is happening. Now, this isn't condoning certain behaviors,
Mm-hmm.
but it's like, I know why people smoke still.
Yeah.
I got to take care of this problem today, but tomorrow I'll quit. But today I'm in such an overwhelmed state that I just need this today.
Yep.
But that's like the pattern that keeps getting repeated. And that could be someone, let's say someone who was raised in like with sort of some extremist fundamentalist type views. We don't serve them or help them by we're going to punch you in the face because of the views you hold, as if that's going to change their mind. I don't think anyone's mind has been changed by an internet argument or a punch in the face. I could be wrong there, but
Maybe.
but an open, but how about a handshake and say, you know what, like, let's talk about this. And actually, on It's Not So Black and White, we just recently had a guest on named Rashawn Parker, and he's a filmmaker and like food documentarian. Beyond the Checkers, I think is what it's called. But he talked about a concept that he wants to start, and it's kind of like breaking bread, but it's bringing people together who hold opposing views over a delicious meal and having them break bread together and talk. And this idea is really interesting, sort of from a cultural perspective. You think about like food and the sharing of food and the trust involved in the sharing of resources in this little microcosm could
Yeah.
be a really fascinating sort of experiment. It could go horribly wrong. They
It,
could end up stabbing each other with the carving knife. But I
it's
think, yeah,
it's almost like hot wings, but more societal focused.
right. Yeah.
I don't know if you've
That's,
ever
isn't that where,
seen the show Hot Wings.
yeah, is that where they eat these insanely hot wings and try
Yeah.
and have a conversation?
Yeah. It's almost like that wouldn't even be bad. Like, oh, you know what? We're gonna have spicy food every time because we're gonna have some form of distraction, right? Like
Yeah.
somebody got some milk before we talk about white supremacy.
Yeah.
Preferably chocolate.
Yeah. Yeah, but these are the conversations like we need to have. And I think this is where podcasting is such an interesting medium. And,
Yeah.
you know, to evoke the name of, I think, the most popular podcaster, maybe Joe Rogan.
It is still.
Still, okay. Why, you know, why does he get viewership? Because he has conversations where he doesn't necessarily shut people down because they hold a view different than his own. Like I'm pretty certain I have never watched a complete episode of his, so I have a limited sort of data set to make a judgment here.
Same.
But my inclination is he's probably fairly left-leaning libertarian, I think, if I was to put him into some sort of category, you know.
I've never thought about it.
Uh,
And I don't have enough experience with Joe to really
fair,
understand whether he is or not.
fair enough. But I know that if like, and I could be wrong there too, but let's just say he's in that category if we want to lump him to one.
Yeah.
The number of people he's had that fit that bill is probably like a fraction of the people he's had conversations with.
Yeah.
The point being, he'll bring just about anybody on and have a conversation and approach that conversation with a curiosity, you know. And that's, I think, why people are drawn to this. Like, you're having the conversations, you're not trying to shut people down, you're not trying to shut people up. You know, now there's a question about social responsibility and amplifying certain views and the potential, you know, but how much trust do we need to put in the individual to be able to listen to that? And maybe are we not giving people trust? Like, are you able to listen to that and maybe not be influenced by it? Like, let's say he was to interview maybe a white supremacist, for example. I don't know if he ever would, but let's say if he was, people might argue that, well, that's going to amplify the views of this, you know, of white supremacy. And I'm like, maybe not. Maybe it helps people understand how people got to that place where they hold this extreme view. And because of that, we could say, well, how do we help people get out of that?
Right.
So
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, I think there's much to be said about if you're afraid of giving people a voice, why don't you speak?
mm-hmm.
Right? Like, why, you know, we have this capacity of like a lot, you know, and whoever controls the narrative really does kind of determine where the narrative goes, right? Obviously. And so if you're afraid of having a white supremacist come onto a show and have a conversation with someone, why don't you talk about it? Never in human history have you, you know, I don't care if you're Sam that works at the gas station down on the corner and you make, you know, $9 an hour, or if you're
Right.
a CEO for Amazon. I don't give a shit. You have equal opportunity at this point, which is remarkable, to share your thoughts, right?
Right.
That's what TikTok has showed us. That's what Instagram of 2013-14 showed us. It's what YouTube of 2009, 2010, and even now, right? It's what Facebook showed us in 2007, 8, 9. Twitter, like all of these social medias have given us the ability at different times to speak. And so if you have a problem with that, good, share it.
Right.
And you might, what's remarkable and what I learned is that when you share ideas, you start to formulate better ideas, because people will come at you with questions that you never thought of, right? They'll come at you with perspective and ideas and say, hey, Dylan, maybe you're wrong. And I'm like, fuck, maybe I am, right? Like for the first time, because I always thought because I always kept everything in my head of like, I know this to be right, but you know what? That's a really good question that makes me wonder if I'm actually wrong. And then you start to see the nuance. So I would push people, if you're thinking in any way that you disagree with something, and you look at a creator, you look at an influencer, you look at video, you look at media, start speaking, right?
Right.
Start sharing your thoughts, and you might just realize that there's a lot more to it. You might just realize you're right. You might realize you're wrong. You might realize that what you think and what everybody else thinks are completely different or the same. I mean, no time in human history have people been given the ability to have a choice and a voice. I mean,
Right.
both
The way that
are
they have
incredible.
now.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's, and I like to even try and scratch under a little bit deeper, like one layer deeper, and try to understand, well, why are we afraid to speak? You know, or why are we afraid to be wrong? Like I think we're afraid to speak because we're afraid, uh-oh, I might be proven wrong.
Yeah.
Okay, well, why are we afraid to be proven wrong? Maybe because the way that I was raised taught me that like being wrong was a bad thing. And I'm not saying that being wrong is a correct thing, but I just mean when we make a mistake, it's a learning moment. If we could see it like that. So where did this fear of being wrong come from? Like I put myself out in the public eye. I've got 3 podcasts. Not that I have a huge following, but it might go somewhere. And at some point, someone might dig up something I said 10 years ago and go, wow, this guy was a dickhead.
Yeah.
Like, you know, and so, but I'm not afraid of being wrong, because if someone shines a light on something I said and said, I believe you to be wrong, and here's why. I mean, heck, we go back to what I posted about the whole, one guy slapped another guy at a trophy show that no one cares about. It was scripted, it was basically what I said.
Yeah.
And one of my friends, I've been friends with him for over 20 years, chimes in and tells me why he thinks I'm wrong. And I didn't get mad at him. I was like, cool, man, you're probably right that my cynicism and disdain for sort of Hollywood and the entertainment industry in a whole, and kind of the abhorrent behavior that they've fostered, is probably coloring my perspective on this incident. It's probably giving me an emotional bias because I have such kind of disdain for the things that they've covered up over the years, and sort of pretending to be this pious beacon of, I don't know, hope and joy when there's like this dirty underbelly of like abuse that's existed for decades. So that is probably coloring my bias. Now, I'm not suggesting that I necessarily agree with you or think you're right or that I think I'm wrong, but I appreciate you like shining a light on where I could be wrong. And I'm open to hearing that.
So it's a remarkably mature point of view to be able to say, I might be wrong. Right.
Yeah.
And I come at it from a perspective of, I assume that I'm wrong. And so I do everything I can to understand whether or not what I am saying is right or wrong. I dig into the research, and eventually I might be wrong to a point of like, I need one more thing to help me understand that this was wrong. And might be in my book, it might be in my podcast, it might be in my TikToks, right? But it brings me to an interview I saw with I think it's John Cena talking about not Chris Rock, but Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson.
Right.
In his capacity between WWE and movies. And, John Cena would look at The Rock and say, why are you never around? If you love this so much, why are you never around? Because you're always doing movie after movie after movie. And when John Cena started to actually do movies, what he realized was, I'm never around. And he looks up and he's like, I spoke from a place of complete ignorance, without understanding that when The Rock would leave for movies, it would give opportunities for guys like me to step into his position and be that person. And when I started to do movies, it gave other people a position to step into my place and make those, become that person. And so having the ability to look back or even look forward and recognize, I might speak from a position of complete ignorance here, I think is a remarkably powerful position to be in. And I think it's going to become trending more often, right? I think it's going to become more acceptable and more worthwhile for people to actually see more and more of that, because I never saw that content of people like, John Cena talking about this interview until I joined TikTok.
Interesting.
Right. Yeah. And I like to really pay attention to what I see, and more specifically where I see it, because the things I've seen on TikTok, I've never seen on Instagram. I've never seen on Facebook. I've never seen on YouTube. I've never seen on Twitter, but now I'm seeing these things. Is it a pendulum shift? Absolutely. Is it going too far? Sure, probably. But that's a good thing in many ways, because that's its own ignorance. And the other side will tell you that is too far.
Right.
And together, you know, I think what social media is ultimately going to do is it's going to create the conversation at scale, right?
Well, when the goal is growth, so I mean, if people watch the intro of It's Not So Black and White, you know, you'll see me quoting that the goal is not to be right. We're changing the goal of the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
The goal of the conversation, like I said with this podcast, that one in particular, I want to put myself in a room with people as smart or smarter than I am. And I want to subject my views to their scrutiny and see what they come up with. I didn't want an echo chamber where we all like smile and nod and slap each other in the back and go, "We're all so smart."
Yeah.
That's how you just remain mired in ignorance. So I want to put myself in the room and hold my views up to scrutiny. And hey, if I can stand my ground with my views, cool. That means that maybe I'm holding a correct perspective. But ultimately, the goal here is growth. And so it goes back to, if we're going to talk about the conversation that's being had, it's like, what is the goal of the conversation? Is it to be right, or is it to grow? Because we could go one step deeper and say, well, what's the point to life? You know, if you're not growing, it's cliche to say that, but if you're not growing, you're dying, you're stagnating. So isn't the goal to pursue growth to some point? And I don't know where you stand in terms of religious or philosophical views on sort of meta life in general, but in my eyes, the view is to grow and to develop and to, you know, I don't know if I'll ever achieve ultimate enlightenment or something like that, but that should be the goal, is to grow, because there's so much gratification in that.
So it's interesting. I had this conversation a long time ago, but I love where it's going, of like, when you think about growing or dying, right? Like I've heard that conversation before, where if you're not growing, you're dying. If you're in between, you're stagnant. But you just said something which I think needs to be brought to the attention of this conversation. You said enlightenment. Well, what does enlightenment mean? What does it mean? The same thing as stagnation? Because in many ways, of like, if you're not growing, you're dying. But what does enlightenment mean? Does enlightenment mean a you know, an exponential growth, or does it mean you're comfortable where you are? And I think that's an important piece of this conversation that often gets left out of. There's this non-moving characteristic to this life, you know, this thing we call life, that if you're not moving, you're not doing anything good.
Right. Yeah.
But there's monks out there that say you need to meditate and just be, right? You just need to exist. You need to live. And so there's this piece of enlightenment that says stagnation is good. And realistically, like, you look at that and you're like, growth, right? You know, especially as a coach, like I've been in this situation of like, I need to be growing. I need to be expanding. I need to be developing. And I quite frankly, I disagree with myself back then, right? Like I've had to look at myself and say, you know what? Sometimes you need to just stop, right?
Well, there's a really interesting parallel here, just because I still work with people in the realm of weight loss. And I sometimes say I want to move away from that in one sense, but it's like, just because I see weight loss as a proxy goal and I want to help people achieve like what they want weight loss to allow them to be able to do. But in this journey, there's going to be plateaus. And I explain to people, these are a necessary part of your journey. Because let's say, you know, biologically speaking, we could say the body has a particular set point. So the body has, in simple terms, it's calibrated its plumbing for you to exist at a certain weight. And then you go and you shift that by 5%. That's a pretty significant shift. And now the body has to recalibrate. So now it needs time to go, let me recalibrate to this new set point. And if you try to push it while it's trying to recalibrate, there's going to be reactionary force that's going to drive you back to where you were before, because it's like, you've not allowed me to acclimatize to this new position. And so in a sense, I love that you just shone a light on this, because I'm like, yes, because I do try to, I mean, I might have came across a little bit binary when I talked about the growth or dying. And so I'm really glad you brought this up, because I really genuinely believe there's value in these plateaus where we kind of consolidate our position. Because we don't have infinite energies. Like we don't just like go 24 hours a day on meth here. We sleep at night. We have downtime, and so on. So this idea of being comfortable in the place of plateau, recognizing it's kind of a consolidation of where we are, where we find our roots. And then another concept I teach is kind of like sprints versus maintenance. And it's this idea, there's certain times in life where we have the opportunity to make a burst. All the stars align and boom, we can kind of shoot forward. And that feels really, really good when that happens. The problem is I want more of that. But in reality, life doesn't, it only gives us like little windows of time for that to happen. And a lot of time it's this unglamorous sort of maintenance phase or this holding pattern that we're in. But that's, if we could start to see it as a good thing, like I don't always have to be pedal to the metal.
Right.
I think life becomes more enjoyable.
Yeah. Absolutely. And that comes to like, what do you think the purpose of life is? Like when you ask yourself that question, I think it's a remarkably individual question, right? I don't think you should ever take mine, or I don't think you should ever take Jonathan's. I don't think you should ever take someone else's unless you really feel it's the way it is. And I think, the purpose of life is to enjoy what this is, what this experience really is, and it's not always to understand it. It's not always to grow. It's not always to, meditate. What it is enjoy it, right? Live with it. There's, 100,000 years ago, maybe it would be to procreate, right? To develop the species and keep it going. But at this point, like, we have a society that it'll do that without people naturally doing it. At some point, we're going to get to the point where we manufacture humans probably. And that's probably an uncomfortable thing to think about now. The reality is probably, we're judgmental beings. And so we're going to look at people and say, we don't want this. We don't want this. We don't want this. We don't want this.
So imagine if we could engineer it out of existence.
And do you think that's going to go away?
Like, probably the desire for that isn't. And I might, if we want to chase this hypothetical, just pull on the string a little bit and go, because I think to myself, well, I'm not entirely comfortable with that. I'm not suggesting again that I'm right here, but I'm not entirely comfortable with this idea of it, because who are we to judge whether or not, maybe there's a place for narcissists that's actually of value in society. That's not to say all narcissists behave well, but you know what? Maybe they function really well within certain roles. There's probably some that we have no idea that they are, and they're of great benefit. Now I'm kind of thinking maybe like, a ground pounder or something like that in the front,
That's just so we're aware, that's what I do. So like, I don't think I'm a narcissist. Let me just defend myself there.
Yeah, of course. I'm not suggesting that's the case for all ground pounders, but
you're not wrong, right? Like there's a really good book on killing, right?
Okay.
And one of the findings of kind of the research behind that book was the people in World War II that effectively engaged the enemy were likely sociopathic, psychopathic, right? And the people that didn't were not, right? And so a remarkably small number, 2% of the military, were answered the surveys of, did you shoot at the enemy? Yes, versus 85% of the military said no, right? They would aim above the arm, the people below, to the side, anywhere else, or they wouldn't shoot. And so there's a place for those people, right? There's a place for people to, and the reality is that sociopathic people and psychopathic people are remarkably good at killing people. So if that's what you need them to do,
right,
maybe there is a place for them. It's a good question.
Yeah. And of course, this is a place that and I don't mind being in an uncomfortable conversation or around an uncomfortable topic, because I think to this, like I'm a peace loving guy. But I've grown up in really privileged circumstances. I grew up in Canada. Like, I got in schoolyard fights as a kid, but back then when you got into a fight, when the guy hit the ground, the fight was done and the other guy won, and you dust yourself off and you're like, you maybe even shook hands after it, because like, okay, you won, you're the better man this time. That's like okay, I obviously went through a violent trauma, and we can touch on that if it's of value to your audience, but
we haven't really touched your story at all. We could get to that.
We could. Because and I think maybe this is a nice sort of natural segue kind of into that experience. So I was living in South Africa, and in that time, we were working on a nature reserve. We were teaching underprivileged youth life skills. And this was a voluntary position. We had some friends. We were traveling around the world. They were South African. They invited us down there to work for this organization that had been running for a number of years. And so out of this reserve, here we have a cohort of maybe 25 students. We're kind of in the middle of nowhere. It's hundreds of acres and wild animals roaming there, like monkeys and rhinos and stuff. And I was just walking back to my cabin one night. So to sort of set the stage, there's like 4 buildings in an L shape. On the top end of the L is the dining hall where everybody was. The next building is the dormitory where the students slept. The next building was the ablution or the washroom facilities. And then off to the side, toward the bottom tip of the L, was the instructor's cabin tucked away in the bushes. So I'm walking back from the dining hall to the cabin. And it's nighttime, it's dark, I'm in flip-flops and my sweats, and I was just like super relaxed. We're connecting with our students, loving the work we're doing. And I open the door to my cabin, and there's 3 guys in there. And the first thought in my head was like, I looked at one of their faces and was like, I know you. And he was one of the Rangers, but he was not in uniform. I didn't see the 4th guy, who was outside the cabin because he was dressed in dark clothing with very dark skin. And I got cracked across the head with a brick. And then that's where it gets interesting, because I kind of think about how time starts to slow down a little bit. And my brain starts to run through all these thought processes like, did this just happen? No, this didn't just happen to me. I wasn't unconscious, but now I'm stunned. The other 3, of course, jump out of the cabin. And the picture I remember the most was, so I'm wearing like a golf shirt for those who are listening, 3 buttons and a collar. This guy, he grabs the collar of my shirt with one hand. He smiles at me and says, shh, as he swings this brick at my head and cracks me across the forehead with it a second time. And that's the part I think that unsettled me the most, was the smile and the shh, and then he cracks me across the head. And I fall to the ground. Now I'm stunned. I'm still not unconscious, thankfully. I didn't, and the other 3 pile on. Now they're just starting to like boot stomp me and kick me. And the goal was actually to beat me to death. They did this to the guy the night before, but I'm actually a pretty big guy, and these guys are relatively small, could we say. And so I managed to fight, I got onto all 4s and kind of managed to fight my way to my feet and run away from them, because I'm not sticking around in the situation when I'm stunned and bloodied and whatnot. And for whatever reason, they didn't chase me. I don't know why. That was probably my saving grace. They also had a knife and they didn't stab me. I don't know why. But I got back to the dining hall where everybody else is, and now blood's like streaming down my face. I'm covered in dirt and mud, and like I've been attacked. And so, people pile into this, everyone like sort of piles into the kitchen, the pantry, like looking for shelter, because they're like, we don't know how many people are out there. Because in South Africa, it's not, we didn't know at the time. There's only 4 of them. There could have been 20 of them for all we know, because they move in packs very often. And so here we are stuck in this building. Of course, I'm like stunned. I'm concussed. I'm sort of trying to piece together what just happened. I was holding a fork. So it's kind of, in hindsight, I look back and like, I was going to defend myself with a fork. I don't know what I was going to do. But certain of like the men, for example, went screaming into the pantry and like went into this closed area and were climbing the shelves. And other of like the men were like, get out, dragging them out of there, being like, we're men, we fight. You get out here. Like, we're going to defend ourselves. And my wife was incredible in all of this. She was like boiling water. She was arming the women. Like, she was ready to fight too. And we were stuck in this building for probably about 40, 45 minutes. Again, not knowing how many people are out there, hoping they didn't have guns because they could have shot us through the windows, while they're like smashing the doors and windows with shovels, trying to break them down. And ultimately, it's fun. Again, we look back in hindsight and go, like, if they had actually broken in, they probably would have been torn to pieces by all of these frantic individuals who are now in this crazy heightened state. Thankfully, one of the students had a phone, and we got enough cell reception to call the police, which were about 45 minutes away. And the police got there, but the thing is, to get to the nature reserve, you have to drive into the entrance and then down through this valley and up the other side, so you can see across the valley. And these guys saw, of course, the cops when they were like 20 odd minutes away, and just sort of melted into the bushes. Well, when the cops show up, this is not like, in North America. They show up and they're like, oh, nobody died. Cool. We're out of here.
Yeah.
They're like, why'd you call us? And we're like, are you kidding? Like, we were just stunned by this. And then my wife was like, she was like in like mama bear mode or something. She was like, you are not leaving here. And she's like literally dragging the cops around being like, look, here's the knife. And this cop just reached down and picks up bare hand. And she's like, what are you doing, you idiot? I was pointing, like she was, it was quite a situation. So anyways, kind of the follow to that situation was I fell into a pattern of binge eating food addiction. So
Hmm.
now like it kind of messed with my head as stuff like that. Like, and nothing really emotionally prepares you to go through that. That was only one incident one night. There were more incidents that happened while we lived in South Africa, none quite as directly violent towards me. But every incident that happens just kind of layers a new layer on top of the old one.
Right.
The brother of one of our facilitators was taken and locked into a building and it was set on fire and burned down. So there was like actions like that because we were educating young people and we were teaching them life skills and so on. And education means that they're a little more difficult to control. And there's a lot of undercurrents in South African society that we would be wholly unaware of over here. And so we got broken into on a weekly basis. Like we were sleeping with weapons by our bed. Like it just feels like you're living in prison. Bars in
Hmm.
the 6-foot wall with razor wires surrounding your house, bars and doors and windows, locking all the doors inside the house, not because it'll stop them, because it'll slow them, you know. It's and just ready to fight every night. And so it's ironic that this was much more like a combat situation than any of my military service, which was actually pretty casual in the Navy, I have to say.
Yeah.
You know, so I go through all of this and I had no idea how to deal with it. And so people in South Africa, the way that they tried to help me deal with this was to tell me, oh, that's nothing. Right? That's nothing. What happened to you was nothing. You should hear what happened to this person. Let me tell you about how they were raped. Let me tell you about how their husband was murdered in front of them. Like the stories that I would hear. You want to talk about layering trauma on trauma on trauma, because I'm an empath and
Hmm.
I'm hearing these stories and I'm going like, you are just crushing my soul with these stories.
Yeah, these are now just possibilities in my overthinking.
Yeah. Yeah. So I was in a pretty bad state. And it got to the place where I was like plotting and setting traps in the house, wanting people to break in so that I could inflict violence on them. And that's when I knew I had to get out of there because either I was going to die or someone else was going to die. And I did not want to be responsible for that if I had a choice.
Oh.
Because in all of this, I knew, like in my heart of hearts, I'm like, I am not a violent person. I do not, it would be an absolute last resort that I would inflict violence on another human being. It would be a desperate last resort. And right now, I'm literally trying to set things up so I could do that to someone.
Mhm.
And there's a part of my brain that goes, you got to get out of here because this is not who you are. This is not going to end well. And, but now I'm just a mess,
Right.
So we flew back to Australia where my wife is from. And I got a job on a farm in like the middle of bumfuck nowhere. Like the nearest town of like 200 people was 30 miles away, and it probably took a few months of working out on this farm before I could like sleep at night realizing there's nobody coming for me. I'm so far in the middle of nowhere, they can't get me. But by this time, I'm like 330 pounds. Like I just ate my way through. I gained 120 pounds in like a 6-month span.
Wow.
Like, yeah, I didn't turn to drugs or alcohol. I turned to food because it was the socially acceptable thing. And so, I'm just like pale and puffy. And that you won't find any photos of me in this state because I was so distressed about everything because I used to be an athlete. So there was also this piece of the puzzle that was like me losing myself altogether. Like I felt like an athlete trapped in a fat body, you know? So, I mean, that's in a nutshell. That's getting me to about from 2011 to 2012. That was a pretty crazy time in life.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't think people really respect, um, certainly people in America, and not everybody in America. 'Cause there's certainly places in which violence does happen, but violence doesn't happen like that here in America.
Right.
And I don't think people really respect what it means to conduct violence on that kind of level, nor do they respect what it means to someone when you go through violence of that level. um, we like to think in our society that we are, you know peaceful people, but in essence we've just given it to other people. We
Right.
are, not to say our military is particularly violent, but our military knows how to conduct violence on a level where nobody wants to conduct violence against us.
Right.
We are a remarkably lethal force because we've learned to understand how to train individuals in conducting violence at range.
Right.
And range offers a considerable disconnection from actually performing it. And so we have these, we have aircraft, we have artillery, we have long range weapon systems, we even have what else? We have drones, right? That we have such a disconnection to actually conducting violence that we're remarkably good at doing it from a long range and not feeling bad about it.
It's a
But
very sanitary experience, if I can put it that way.
yeah, absolutely. And what we have forgotten in many ways is that, and I think people are seeing it in Ukraine and with Russia, is that when you conduct a war, like there's no way, like Iraq in 1991 was not just an air war, right? Infantry is going to have to get on the ground and fight in direct conflict with human beings. And so there's no war that's ever going to be won by air. There's no war that's ever going to be won with a cruise missile. People are going to fight it out in the trenches in hand-to-hand combat at some point in some way. It happened in Afghanistan. It happened in Iraq. It's happening in Ukraine and Russia right now. It's happened across the world in every conflict that has ever existed. And you can get completely discombobulated if you don't understand that concept. If you don't understand that eventually people are going to come face to face with violence, and you never, I don't think you have a complete perspective on people until you come face to face with that, at least in research and understanding, because this is one of the issues I have with sociology in general. And I come from a sociology background, both undergrad and graduate school. I just never finished graduate school. But I struggle with it because there's a disconnection with violence. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to have a conversation about it, at least in my experience, of what is violence. There's very few sociologists that have actually asked the question, right? Randall Collins is one of them. He wrote a book about it, but that's about it. Right? There's no real defining understanding of what is violence. So oftentimes we look at it from a criminologist perspective of homicide rate is a condition of studying violence, or assaults and batteries, and the number of crimes of a violent nature helps us understand society's understanding of violence. It doesn't understand the anecdotes that, like what you just said, of like, this guy smiled at me before he hit me. You don't understand that. You don't understand how that's even possible, because in LA, same things happen, right?
Right. Yeah.
Like in gang fights, like there's not just a pervasiveness of the violence itself, it's also how the violence is conducted.
Yes.
And there's a will within people that they want you to remember this, so you never conduct that against them.
Yes.
Or at least that's a potential.
Mm.
And there's many potentials that are out there. And if you don't know how to have a conversation about that, if you think violence is, if you're just a peace-loving individual that's like, which is funny when we talk about Will Smith and Chris Rock here, right? A lot of celebrities who are not condoning Will Smith's violence are also like, well, I'm a very peace-loving person. I don't think we don't have any need for war. I'm like, fuck, we don't, right?
Right.
Russia just invaded Ukraine. Like, if a people or a person invades your place, your sovereignty, your space, and you tell them no, and they keep coming, there's absolutely a place for violence. And if you don't understand that, you're going to be that person someday that has a person looking at you and saying, shh, and smiling at you and hitting you with a brick upside the head.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
I appreciate this conversation, because I've just talked about this incident before, but never like from this perspective, really. And I think it's really valuable, because it didn't it brought me to the place where I wanted to inflict violence. And I believe that was me trying to take back something that was taken from me.
Yeah.
When I look back, they took my power. They jumped me at night. They jumped me forward. Like I have a real sense of fairness, or I try to live with a sense of fairness. And this was extremely unjust. And it was a racially motivated attack. This is, you know, I'm not asking for any kind of sympathy. Like, I'm actually grateful for this experience. I would not remove it from my past, but it led to like 8 years of hell.
Yeah.
And it's, you know, it's funny. I talk about that, and sometimes I almost feel guilty saying that I struggled for that long with it. And I recognize that maybe there really shouldn't be a place for that. But just thinking that I just went through that one time,
Mm-hmm.
and it damaged me enough that I went through a lot of struggle to get to the other side of it.
Yeah.
I can only imagine what someone who went through something
And
multiple times over multiple years.
and never escaped it.
Yeah.
Like you had a different opportunity. You had
Mm-hmm,
the
mm-hmm.
opportunity to leave, right?
Yeah.
There's entire societies predicated on that idea of living in that, right? And
Yeah.
that's the unfortunateness of South Africa,
I'm
of
like,
what,
literally, this is South African society.
right? And we like to be this third person observing it and saying, well, you shouldn't do that. Like, you don't
Right.
fucking know what the hell is happening in South Africa, or what has happened, in the
It,
intricacies of that
yeah.
complex society.
Yeah. So here's kind of an interesting sort of part of my journey. So it was probably maybe 8 months later after the incident. I was living with my brother in Turkey. My wife and I went back to Turkey to live with my brother there. And the one thing I didn't want anymore was the rage. Like,
Yeah.
it would just come out of nowhere. This all encompassing rage where all I wanted to do was lash out at the nearest person to me. And I never acted on it, but it took like every ounce of strength not to. And it's this really, again, it's this really almost terrifying place to be. Like, why is this with this level of strength coming up within me, trying to compel me to act in a way that goes against the values I hold dear?
Right.
So it's and I don't know that everybody would necessarily think about it kind of in the way that I thought about this. I'm, you know, I do a lot of zooming out and thinking, but here I am like grappling with this in a very real and raw way, this rage and this desire to inflict violence. Well, there's a part of my brain going, you shouldn't do this. You're not this person. And it was, you know, I can kind of smile. I say, because I've done a lot of the work, I can kind of smile about it. And, you know, but this in the time, of course, it was hell.
Yeah.
So I said, okay, I have to do something, because like I'm gonna just end up getting into a street fight in Turkey or something like
Yeah.
that. Like, you know, some guy's gonna just say something stepping out of a taxi, and there's gonna be a cultural misunderstanding or something, and you know, it's just gonna end badly for me again. So I made the decision that I was gonna forgive these guys. Like, I never saw them again. They did get three of them because they murdered a guy the night before. The cops shouldn't have told us this, but they smashed his head in like a pumpkin, and that was their intent. And so I said, okay, like I couldn't go back for the court cases. Like I just was not in a mental state to face these guys again at that point in time. But I said, I'm going to forgive them. And so now starts this journey of, okay, well, what does that mean? Like, how do I forgive people, not only who tried to kill me, who would do it again, and who would do it again with a smile on their face? How do I forgive that? And the goal here was not to absolve them of like what they did, but it was to set myself free from the desire for vengeance and rage in this instance, so that each time I would relive or recount the story, you know, because people are curious, and the number of people that just, with absolute ignorance, maybe well-meaning ignorance, would want to know about it just out of a morbid curiosity, would have no idea how triggering it was to be asking me about this. But I was so uncomfortable trying to tell them not to ask me about it, that I just fought this whole internal battle. So I thought this was maybe my way out. So I started with, the rage would come up, and then I would try and go, okay, what happened to these guys? What happened to them that brought them to this place in their life where this is what they're doing, where they think this is a desirable course of action, a necessary course of action? What happened to them? Because I bet if I met them as kids, I wouldn't have looked at them and said, you guys are going to be violent killers one day. And so I tried to cultivate this sense of compassion for them and use that to counter the rage that I had. And it was this back and forth process for probably 6 months before I finally felt like, I think I'm free from the rage. That, of course, that wasn't free from my struggle, but that was like the first step to setting myself free. I was going, okay, I forgive these guys. I do not, and forgiving was not like, I forgive you, but I hope God smites you. You know,
Yeah.
it's I forgive you, and I don't wish vengeance upon you in any way, shape, or form from anybody. And that sets me free. And it started from this place of compassion.
I would argue that it was less compassion and more empathy.
Okay, yeah.
Because I think there's a vast difference between the two, right? Because
Yeah.
you did the one thing that empathy is, of like you placed yourself in their experience and tried to understand, you
Right.
know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Compassion is giving. Oh man, I almost have to look it up because I want to
Yeah.
know. I want
No,
to know the
and
definition now.
yeah, because I mean, the way that I try to think about compassion is seeking to understand a behavior without judgment.
So compassion is sympathetic pity and concern for the sufferings or misfortunes of others. And I look at empathy as, my definition of empathy is listening to understand, right? And so so let's look up the ability to understand and share the feelings of another.
And so maybe I would say there's probably elements of both there.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah, the ability to try to understand how they got to that place.
Yeah.
And again, not to excuse the behavior, but to say like, this is how you got here. And also maybe to let go of my own ego. Like they didn't know Jonathan.
Mm-hmm.
They had no idea who I was. I was a nothing to them. The only thing I was a white guy.
Yeah. Your
That
target.
was that was literally it. And so I think there was maybe a journey like I had to go on in terms of letting go of my own ego, which wanted to make this all about me, because there's
Yeah.
an attractiveness to wallowing in victimhood.
Yeah.
And there's a part of me that would want to sort of wallow in that victimhood and then be justified to be in this place.
What's funny is I'm about to drop a TikTok video, and if anybody remembers this, when they see this podcast in 3 or 4 months, I'll be surprised. But I'm about to drop a video that talks about, I start with, what's wrong with you. At some point in your life, you became a victim to words, and not just anyone's words, your own words, right? Because you craft, and the whole idea behind this video is to understand you craft your experience with your own words,
Yeah.
right? And if someone tells you, if someone looks at you and says you're fat, right? Because that's a common theme throughout life. I think if you gain any weight, guess what? Someone's going to look at you and say you're fat.
Sure.
You can take that word that someone else gave you, and you can create a whole personality out of it. You
Right.
can
Yeah.
you can craft an entire identity around it because, well, I can't do anything else. I can't do anything differently. Like that. I can't do anything about this, and so I may as well create it. Right. You might go through a trauma, right? Which, especially women, but also men. I just think it's more common for women who have been through something like sexual assault or rape to gain weight makes them less of a target.
Yeah.
And
100%.
and
I see
so
this directly in my work.
and so it's not necessarily as much as victimhood as a sense of safety, of creating the identity in terms of how people express things to you. You almost craft your own version of safety, even though it's a falsehood. You just don't understand exactly what it means to be safe. And so, what's interesting to me is you had this conceptualization of your own rage. And oftentimes what I see when we talk about trauma is that what you harness following the situation, following PTSD, or following, with CPTSD or whatever it is that you're dealing with, that expression is often the thing that was meant to happen. It's what you wanted to happen. It's what you wanted to craft in the scenario to say, if I become rage driven, I could have beat every single one of them. Right. And there's a
100%.
potential there, right?
Well, so this is exactly, I'm like, bingo. So the times that I would relive the experience, I was literally reliving it to try to rewrite it almost.
Yeah. That's called renegotiation. That's actually what's remarkable about this is that's exactly how Peter Levine would tell you to overcome your scenario.
Interesting. From Waking the Tiger, because I've just actually started doing some somatic experiencing just very recently.
Yep.
Because there's still areas of this that are unresolved, and this is just another interesting and probably open exploration where I kind of still engineer my environment to maintain my weight loss, because there's still elements that that I'm uncertain about how to resolve within me.
Yeah.
And but in this case, yeah, I was literally, if I knew this, I would have done that. If I knew this, I would have done that. And that was probably what was taking place, was exactly that. I was rewriting the story.
Yeah.
You
And
know.
that's, I think, I can't say this with 100% certainty, but I think men are better at it.
Yeah.
Because men are taught. I think it's a cultural thing, not just a gender thing. I think it's culturally, men are taught to solve your fucking problem, right?
Right.
We're not going to give you any help, solve your problem. And so we're culturally engineered to say, okay, here's what I would have done. And if it ever happens again, I'm going to do that. Right. And so we solve our problem, we try to solve our problem step by step. But I don't think it's something that only men can do. Right. I think it's something that men have a proclivity to do because we're culturally engineered that way. But that's a cultural engineering, which means that I think I've seen women do it too. Right. And so I can't say that it's only a male idea. I think it's something that women need to maybe take notes from men on.
Yeah.
It's something that I think, like, listening to your story, you've engineered your path to healing through that modality of, you can call it somatic experiencing, but really it's renegotiation. It's re-engineering your narrative, which I think
Right.
that's the idea of all of this. And like, you can live within the narrative that you are the failure, you're the loser, you're the weak one, or whatever. You can live within that, or you can live with the idea, or create the idea and craft the idea that you're the survivor.
Yeah.
That you lived, that you overcame, that you are now here doing what you're doing now. And that's
Right.
That's a remarkable thing to kind of dig into.
Well, what's also very interesting here is when I started doing the work that I do now. Well, I mean, I really started as like a macros and meal plan kind of coach, because that's, I think, where every nutritionist probably starts. Let me start with the variables I can control, because I don't know how to work with human beings,
Yeah.
so I'll just give them variables. But but to get to this place and doing the work I do now, I had to sort of let go of those securities and say, I need to be willing to step into these really uncomfortable conversations with people where I don't necessarily step in saying, I'm going to solve your problem.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's such an important thing to do as a coach.
When I start working with somebody, I say to them, I'm going to be your tour guide, but I am not your Sherpa. And it would be very disempowering if I was to try to take your problems, solve them, and hand them back to you.
Right.
You have learned nothing. You have not grown. This is, in fact, me, in a sense, almost infantilizing you, saying, you are not capable of doing this. Let me do it for you. And I see this sort of in this coach-client type relationship. Clients even looking for this, I think, maybe often speaking from a place of overwhelm. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to solve this. Just solve it for me. Make it go away. But what I really appreciate or enjoy about this process is, let me show you what you have within you. Let me show you the strength and ability that you have. Because I think there's kind of a really interesting nugget of conversation here, just even around, I'm like choosing my words carefully, but really around how we discuss the topic of masculinity, and how we are almost like maybe thinking that a lot of elements of masculinity are negative. And I don't think that's the case. And in fact, and I could be off the mark, but sometimes I get a sense of we're trying to push men towards more of the feminine side. And I don't know that, because of course men do have maybe a greater proclivity towards physical violence. We figure if we can maybe push men a little bit more in the feminine, gentle direction, that we would see less violence in the world. Now, I could be off the mark here. This is a very new sort of concept I'm exploring in a sense, but sure. I'm kind of throwing that out there because I would really love to hear your thoughts on it.
Well, man, that's something I've been thinking about for quite some time. I lost my dad to suicide at 6 years old, and I was raised by two women, right? I was raised for pretty much all my life by two women, right? My mom and my sister. My sister was older than me she's older than me by 4 years. And so I was raised without, outside of the first, my dad died around 8 years old, and that is when I got my first male role model of sorts. And he disciplined me, right? I use that in air quotes and some emphasis on it as whatever I did wrong, I was beaten with a leather belt from small of my back down to my calves, right? To the point of like,
Boy.
when I would sit in class, I would have to constantly be sitting on my hip, right? I would have to switch hips, which is funny because I notice now when I sit in a computer chair for a long time, I do that sometimes. I switch to my hip because it would hurt so bad, right? And so anytime I did something wrong, that was my first, immediately after my dad's suicide, that was my first male interaction with discipline, right? And so I learned how to address pain very silently, right? Because I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of hearing me cry, because it became me against him kind of thing.
Right.
And so around 10 to 12 years old is when we left that situation and I no longer had that male role, right? And so I had a male role for probably at maximum 8 years of my life that I shouldn't even say that because it's like probably 4 to 6 years that I actually remember, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so it was a remarkably small amount of time. And so I learned an interesting kind of relationship with masculinity and femininity, right? Certainly I had the male kind of dominance idea of not necessarily dominance, but the masculine requirement to dominate things, right? Within the cultural realm that I lived in. I saw that. I was bullied throughout high school and I was like, you know what, fuck this. I'm done with this. I'm going to join the army. 1, to die. 2, maybe it'll teach me how to fight back against people, right? So I did that. But I always had that underlying foundation of understanding what it was like to be emotional. I didn't understand how to operate with it because it was not culturally developed within me.
Right.
I was never given a platform to speak, to expose things without any judgment. So I didn't have that capacity, but I was forced in many ways within my family structure and basically within my friend structure of being the person that helped people understand their feelings. I've always been this person for people, that mental health coaching side, because I understood stuff. I had a different perspective. And there's a feminine nature to it in terms of emotions, but I don't like the juxtaposition of masculinity and femininity. I just don't like it. I think it's a worthless kind of discussion necessarily, because it's just a lack of words. It's a lack of, we have a lack of words of how to define what that feeling is. I think there's this natural tendency for humans to be higher on the hierarchy, right? And I think Jordan Peterson talks about this, but it's not perfect, right? He compares people to lobsters and their dominance factor, but there is a natural tendency to craft a hierarchy, right? This person better than this person below this person. We always want to be liked. We want to be appreciated. We want to be loved. We want to be looked at as respected. And at the same time, we have emotions, and society is is cultural. Society has crafted this ideal that we can't be emotional, right, as men.
Right.
And so there's this masculine idea that you have to suffer in silence, right? And then that's only exposed further in the military of like, now you're in a team setting and you certainly have to suffer in silence because you could affect the team. You could affect morale. You could affect lethality. You can affect all sorts of things. You can get us in a lot of trouble. And so you're only taught more how to be silent. And all of that happens the same in females in different circumstances, right? Which is why I do not like the idea of masculinity and femininity. We share all of the same emotions. We're different. We're under different circumstances. And certainly there's a slight difference in biology, right? That's about it. Or that's how I look at it. And so women have to be silent in many regards about their sexual preferences in terms of in history about when they want sex or when they don't. And culture has certainly has started to transition to a point where women have a voice now, but historically women have never had the ability to say, prior to, I would say, probably 1980, 1990, maybe, the advent of the internet, women haven't really had the ability to say, no, I don't want sex, because men will take it from them. And that's historically been proven, right? There's whole cultures. I'm Nordic, right? I'm Norwegian. There's a whole culture behind my family history, Vikings, where they literally would go to people's shorelines and raid their villages and rape their women, right? Like there's a sense of dominance. There's a sense of hierarchy of like, we're better than you, remember it, kind of thing. It's that proclivity for humans to be violent, and they would bring women with them. And so they would have women killing other people there. And it's like, we've crafted this idea of masculinity and femininity to be, it's a product of society. It's a product of culture. And it's not necessarily, I think it distracts us from the real conversation. We all need to be able to express our emotions. We all need to be able to look at each other and say, I respect you, but I disagree with you, or I agree with you. And that idea of masculinity in juxtaposition to femininity says that men have to be this and women have to be this, when the reality isn't necessarily the case, because women are oftentimes like this and men are oftentimes like this, and they live life. Right.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of how I look at it. I use the conversation of masculinity and femininity as a way to talk about it, but I really just don't have a strong belief in what those words really represent, if that makes sense.
It does. And that's a very, very interesting perspective. And I like how you were able to sort of dissect it and break it down, because you're almost saying like we're more similar than we are different. Yeah. And it revolves around this idea about being able to, it's being acceptable to express emotions. And I'm keeping an eye on the clock, but because I think there's a whole nother conversation to be had here, just around even our fear of emotions.
Yeah.
And so that leads us to have this desire, how do I regulate this? So with men, we seek to control our emotions kind of with strength. I'm going to force them down. I'm going to suppress them. That's what I did.
With anger.
Yeah.
Which apparently is not an emotion, right?
Right.
Nope.
Yeah. So we that's what we were conditioned to do. And there is a time and a place. Obviously we need, I use the term regulate because I think that's a pretty good way of expressing it right now. We need a way to regulate them, because obviously if we were purely emotional, we would just be entirely irrational and we'd be subject to all of these crazy whims. On the other hand, if we were purely logical, we'd be psychopaths. And so we're sort of dancing this fine line, like how do we regulate our emotions without suppressing them? How do we navigate them without necessarily letting them be entirely in control? Because we know that like when emotions are in control, we don't always make the best decisions, but we want emotion to maybe influence our decision making. And maybe that's where the challenge lies. How do we appropriately allow and use emotions for the greatest benefit without necessarily causing great harm? Because we know that like people in very emotional states have done very destructive and reckless things. So that's, I think, maybe what I'm trying to express is just our difficulty in figuring out how do we navigate having emotions without like burying them entirely.
It's, I think, an age-old question, right? That may never have a solution necessarily. I have a perpetual job, I think, because of it, right?
Yeah,
like I look at this and I'm like, I wish I didn't have to do this job, right? I wish I didn't have to step onto TikTok and talk about mental health and talk about emotions and talk about just, hey, it's okay to talk, right? Like I feel that, in 2022, I shouldn't have to be online saying, you can come to me and have a conversation about the things that are the hardest things in your life to say. I feel like I shouldn't have to do that, but obviously there's people still that have, you know, I'm wearing a shirt that says mental health stigmas don't break themselves, right? That's a real thing, right? Like
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
stigmas around the world, not just around our society, that are built upon perpetuating the idea of suppressing emotion, you know, and suppressing mental, you know, mental dysfunction and disorder, because it's inconvenient, it's uncomfortable, right? We don't want things unkept in our society, so maybe you should shut the fuck up, right? So
Right.
like
Yeah. Yeah.
that's basically what we're told from a young age on. And so, but I think that's changing, right? Will it ever go away? I don't think so, because people will always be kind of uncomfortable when people are acting a fool or acting crazy, right? Like there's
Right.
always
Yeah.
going to be
Yeah.
this situation where dysregulation of emotions becomes uncomfortable, regardless of, you know, how much we have the conversation. It's
Right.
certainly,
Yeah.
I deal with it every day, and there's still moments where I'm like, man, this is hard, right? I just had a conversation with a client yesterday that was, you know, we had a conversation 2 weeks ago. She remembered something that she was uncomfortable with and what I said, and it was a triggering point, right, where she was triggered. She was going through, you know, she was just really struggling with some things, and I'm like, I don't really know how to address this, so I'm going to go down this direction, and I did.
Hmm.
But it turned out to be something that she was uncomfortable with, but she didn't tell me until 2 weeks later. And so, regardless of your position and your experience, I turned out to be wrong, but I
Yeah.
didn't find out until 2 weeks later. And so, it becomes really easy if you don't create the structure of your interactions to be open and
Hmm.
honest, to be clarifying of like, hey, I can be fucking wrong. I need you to tell me, right? If I wasn't like that, she would never have told me. And I would have
Right.
never been
Yeah.
able to say to her yesterday, listen, I'm sorry for that. That wasn't my intention. And looking back at it now, I realized that was fucking stupid. That was
Right.
complete ignorance on my part. Right. And I never would have looked back on it. And so I always kind of come back to this idea that you have to be, you know, I think, you know, if you want to look at it from masculine, feminine, I think this feminine idea of choosing your words very wisely, because I don't think that's a male trait necessarily in culture.
Right.
We are far more rash or brash and honest. Sometimes
To a
a
fault.
fault.
Mm.
You know, this idea of choosing your words more wisely is really important, regardless of who you are, right?
Yeah.
You know, and it's a fundamental skill. And one part of choosing your words wisely is saying, I'm not going to choose my words wisely all the time. And so I need
Right.
you to be able to share your words with me when I make a mistake.
Yeah.
And also then being able to follow it up with, tell me those mistakes and I won't sit there and judge you for it. I will listen to you. Right. And that's
Right.
kind of that empathy that, you know,
Yeah.
I think just needs to be more apparent in society if we're going to have any respect for anybody.
Well, what a fantastic approach, though, because I imagine, maybe not, I could be wrong, but I imagine this would probably improve whatever that relationship is, because you said, hey, I've created this space for you to tell me that I'm wrong. And when you tell me that I'm wrong, I'm not going to defend myself. I'm going to clarify and make it right.
Yeah.
So now that relationship is in a more secure and a more trusting place, not a place of I expect you to be perfect, but it's like, hey, I know where you're coming from. And man, I think my wife and I've had so many of these conversations, right? Where it's like,
Yeah.
shoot, I wasn't trying to say it that way, but in the moment, that's how it got received, or that's how it got perceived. And
Right.
I'm sorry.
Yep.
You know, like two of the most like valuable words that we have in our lexicon are I'm sorry. I want to make it right because I want this relationship to continue.
Yeah. And they're also two of the most dangerous words, I think, because if you look at this, if you have a more dominant style of communication and personality, kind of a mix of both, either one, I'm sorry, can be some of the most powerful things you ever say to people. If you're a people pleaser, I'm sorry, can be the most destructive thing you can ever say to people, to
Right.
yourself, not
Yeah.
not to them, but to
Yeah.
yourself.
Yeah.
And it's what's remarkable about that is like the juxtaposition of just how real that is on both sides.
Yeah.
You know, like that's anything can be a strength and anything can be a weakness. If you think I'm sorry is a strength, talk to a people pleaser and watch them live, because eventually, I mean, there's whole books written on it.
There's suffering. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And you will suffer. I promise you. If you only say I'm sorry to people, you are going to suffer for the rest of your life. If you never step into a conflict and say, you know what, I'm not sorry, I'm hurt here, and I have a problem, right? I'm not sorry I made you uncomfortable with that. I'm hurt, and I expect a conversation, or I expect a conflict here. Like you never really learn how to renegotiate that narrative of you're always the problem, you know, because that's what people pleasing is you create yourself as the problem and you become a victim to your own words.
Yeah. That's powerful.
Yeah. It's brutal. It's a brutal life to live, you know?
Well, I think if we go into it with this idea, look, life, you know, discouragement comes from when sort of expectations and reality don't line up.
Yeah.
And so if we can kind of go into it saying, look, I expect that life is going to challenge me. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be messy and all of that. But I know there's going to be some moments of joy along the way. I can navigate that. But if I go into it expecting it's going to be what, you know, a fairy tale that a movie told me, I'm going to be sorely disappointed for the rest of my life, because somehow that expectation is never going to be met. So what needs to be adjusted? You know, reality or your expectations?
Yeah. Which is easier to adjust.
Yeah. Yeah.
Some people think reality is easier to adjust and they just don't make it through.
Right. I think that's where what's, you know, often like drugs and alcohol come into the picture.
Yep.
This is where we alter our perception of reality.
Yep.
Through these means. So,
oh man, that brings a lot of different ideas of what we can talk about, but I don't know how much time you have, but I think we should probably wrap this up, and we might have to have further conversation on this at some point.
I think we will, man. This has been one of the most, like, 2 hours have flown by.
Yeah, it's crazy how fast it's come. But let's well, before we get into the last question, how can people reach you? What's, you know, I'll have, there's 2 links I'm going to share down low, but how can people connect with you, reach you, find you?
Well, you could help my TikTok following grow.
For sure.
I got 31 followers, and let you know. So Coach JONM on TikTok, and I'll occasionally post on there just in return for people following me. freedomnutritioncoach.com is my website. And you can probably find find that on all the socials. The other side of it would be Coach John Podcasts. So one of those two, either way, if you want to hear my podcasting, or if you want to know more about my nutrition coaching, those are the places you'd find me.
Perfect. We'll make sure those are linked below, and you can find them. But wouldn't be much of a podcast without the final question. So I hope you've been thinking about it. If there was one thing that you could leave the world, one message you could leave the world, what would it be?
I think just the ability to step back from time to time and try to look at life from a slightly different perspective. So whether it's compassion, whether it's empathy, just maybe even holding the willingness to step back and see a different perspective can really change how we approach relationships. So not necessarily looking at it from a binary right and wrong perspective, but like with subtle nuance. And I believe that's something that we have to develop as like a skill or an ability. It's not something necessarily that comes to us innately. And so it's a really, really powerful thing if within you find yourself cultivating this ability to step back and look at things through a nuanced lens.
Yeah, absolutely. I love it, Jonathan.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you again for having me on your show. And then I also want to thank you for coming and joining me here and sharing all of the, you know, all of the wisdom and all of the conversation and the discussion we've had, and especially your story. I'm honored to hear that, and I'm honored to share that with people that I hope will take it in a direction that will help them. I think that's who follows me, is the people that want that.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you haven't at this point, if you haven't followed Jonathan, if you haven't gone and found him, please go check him out. I'm sure I will also be on his other podcast. So
You will.
Go check
Yeah,
that out.
you'll be on the other two, because clearly we have more conversations that need to be had. So
Right.
your story, I want to tell your story to more people, because I love the work you're doing, and I just want to pick your brain in the other room if it's not so black and white, because I think you bring such a thoughtful perspective that, even leaving this conversation, I'm leaving it with different perspectives. And so I think that's why it's been so enjoyable, is because I'm leaving this with like some changed perspectives, some valuable insights that I was able to get because I just put something forward and you challenged it in a very respectful way. And I love that. And I want us to have more conversations like that.
That's what I try to do. I don't want to, I don't want people to step away from a conversation with me and be like, that guy is a fucking asshole. Like I would love to continue to have relationships and continue to have people that come back to me, because he never makes me feel bad about thinking something, right?
Yeah.
It's not the thinking that I have a problem with. It's the action, right? If you think something is bad, but you want to talk about it, you want to determine whether it is bad, and you have that conversation, you shouldn't be punished for thinking that. You should be punished if you actually follow through with it, knowing it is bad.
Right.
Right. And even, you might have to be punished in some way or disciplined in some way for doing it and not knowing it's bad. Right. Yeah. And that's always how intent, is understood. But yeah, I don't like to bring disrespect into a conversation unless it absolutely requires it. That's not my goal. It's not what I want.
Right. And maybe the same could be said for violence, is we don't want to utilize it unless it's the last resort. So
Yep. And I've certainly had an understanding of violence that I can bring it if I have to, but I certainly know its capabilities and its consequences. So I don't particularly want to, but I will. That's the hardness of nature coming out of, like, you can't be a pacifist in nature.
Right.
You have to be willing to end a life if it comes down to between you and them, and if you don't have the capacity to really respect that, you're probably not going to live very long.
Fair enough.
And if that's what you want, that's what you get. But if that's not what you want, then you might want to learn a little bit about violence and understand it.
Yeah. I love that perspective. Let's bring that one into the next show.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Jonathan, again, thank you for coming on. And if you've listened this far into this episode, thank you. This has been a long one. It's been a good one, but I love it. I love this.
You're giving Joe Rogan a run for his money.
This is absolutely my own selfishness coming out of, like, I want to talk to someone for this long. If people don't listen, that's not my problem. Like, I'm going to post it anyway. If people want to, go for it. If they don't, have fun.
That's all good. Yeah.
But alas, this is the final adieu for episode 44. So thanks for watching, and we'll catch you next time on the Dylan Experience. Boom. That's it.